Hi everyone, we are here today to discuss sexual harassment in the workplace. 30 years ago, this discussion maybe would have been, what is sexual harassment and why should we start trying to root it out of the workplace? Thankfully, we've progressed as a society since then, and now the discussion is moved towards how do we prevent sexual harassment and stop it from being so prevalent. It's my theory, as a part of this presentation, that through using an ethical decision-making framework, we can understand sexual harassment better and why it occurs, and thus prevent it. First, what is sexual harassment? Sexual harassment can come in two forms, first of which is quid pro quo sexual harassment. This can look like either sexual bribery or sexual intimidation or coercion. Sexual bribery occurs when the harasser is in a position of power, a supervisor, manager, executive, and the person that is being harassed is at a lower level. And the harasser may offer rewards in exchange for sexual activity. The other form is sexual intimidation and coercion, and this is quite the opposite. So instead of, if you do this, I will give you a reward, it is, if you don't do this, I will threat retaliation in the form of loss of pay, status, or even employment. And thankfully, this type of sexual harassment is the least common form in the workplace. The second type of sexual harassment is hostile work environment sexual harassment. This can come in the form first of gender harassment, which is a general hostility towards one gender, or vulgarities or inappropriate jokes, or obscene pornographic material in the workplace. And working in manufacturing, I can definitely tell you this occurs. And with this form of sexual harassment, sexual desire is not required, meaning it just can be rude comments about women. There doesn't have to be any threats or sexual desire. The second form is unwanted sexual attention, which is persistent sexual advances. Now, it's not sexual harassment to ask someone on a date. When it becomes sexual harassment is when this behavior is unwelcome, unreciprocated, and considered offensive by the victim. And these threats also do not have any threat of retaliation. Legally, why is sexual harassment important? Well, it is something that is prosecuted under the EEOC. The EEOC defines sexual harassment just as we did before. It's unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual activity, and offensive comments about gender. And in order to be prosecuted under the EEOC, the harasser does not need to be a supervisor, and the perpetrator's and victim's gender is irrelevant. Now, also, it is a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Just to give you a scope of how often sexual harassment occurs, over 25,000 cases were filed with the EEOC in 2017, and as a result of these cases, $135 million was paid out in monetary benefits in the same year. Taking away the legal aspect of it, why is it important from an ethical perspective? Well, three reasons. Sexual harassment violates people's bodily and psychological integrity. Half of victims of sexual harassment experience physical advances, which is obviously a violation of their bodily integrity. And not only physically, but those who are sexual harassment victims also experience increased rates of psychological stress and health problems as a result of the sexual harassment. Secondly, sexual harassment is a huge abuse of power. In most cases, 80% of physical advancement involved a harasser who had firing or advancement authority, meaning that it is often occurring when the harasser is in a position of power, and the victim feels like they do not have control over the situation and fear retaliation if they speak up. And then lastly, employers have a burden to society to provide harassment-free workplaces, meaning this is not considered optional to provide safe work environments. This is something that anyone who wants to be in business needs to take this seriously. And obviously, we are not doing our job as employers, considering that 48% of working women have reported that they have experienced sexual harassment within the last year. Now, it's my contention that in order to help prevent sexual harassment, we can use the ethical decision-making model and look at ethical issue intensity, individual factors, organizational factors, and opportunity. And we can look at those dimensions and see what actions we can take as employers to prevent sexual harassment from occurring. First, ethical issue intensity as it relates to sexual harassment is the degree to which sexual harassment prevention is considered important or relevant by employees. The problem with ethical issue intensity is that in any workplace, different employees will vary in their definitions of sexual harassment and their ethical awareness or ability to identify harassment when it occurs. This means that in order to prevent sexual harassment, moving to the next slide, it is incumbent upon the employer to define sexual harassment and tell the employees that this is something that as an organization we will not tolerate and will take active steps to root out. As such, all employers should provide sexual harassment prevention training, and they should give definitions of harassment and say that it will not be tolerated. And the training should not just happen at the outset of employment, but also have follow-up trainings throughout the year. And then also, as we talk about a lot, emphasis for sexual harassment has to begin at the very top, at the board of directors and at the executive level. Next, individual factors is the employees' diverse backgrounds and value systems will affect their likelihood to commit, prevent, or report sexual harassment. Looking at individual factors, the research has shown that there's one individual factor that correlates very highly with the likelihood of someone committing sexual harassment, and that is sexism. Now, we all know hostile sexism, which is the belief and the actions that emphasize power, dominant sexual roles, and views women as objects. It's probably no surprise that this correlates highly with sexual harassment in the workplace. And also, those who commit hostile sexism are likely to see the victims of sexual harassment as deserving of blame and saying that it's not their fault, it is thus the woman's fault. But probably less surprising is benevolent sexism, which is the belief and actions that perpetuate and justify traditional gender roles. And what I mean by that is these type of people believe that women should stay at home, women should not be in leadership roles, that men should be in leadership, and women universally practice the actions of nurturing and caring. And in this view, women and men are seen as holding complementary strengths and weaknesses. Interestingly, those who practice benevolent sexism do not consider themselves sexist. So this is a more innocuous, or believing to be innocuous, but in fact very harmful, as these individuals are also likely to commit sexual harassment in the workplace. Now, how do we prevent this? It is incumbent upon the organization to combat prescriptive gender stereotypes. Organizations should work towards increasing the presence of women in executive positions, either at managers and board of director level. The Worthian hypothesis states that language affects our cognitive structures. And what I mean by that is sometimes you hear locker room talk when people say degrading things towards women. And why that can't be allowed in organizations, regardless of whether it's meant hostilely or not, is that when we use language that degrades anyone, including women, that language eventually affects our cognitive structures, meaning our beliefs, and our beliefs affect our actions. So the organizations need to have a zero tolerance policy for locker room talk. Additionally, organizations can screen employees for potential risk factors, and this can be either questions in the interview and also be sought out through background checks and checking individuals and applicants' referrals. Next, organizational factors. The organizational culture will affect the likelihood sexual harassment will occur and how sexual harassment incidents will be handled. First, does the organization have an ethical culture? Studies obviously show that organizations that emphasize ethical behavior and weed out misconduct are less likely to have incidents of sexual harassment. And interestingly, it's been shown that a patriarchal culture, meaning one with emphasizes men and men's interests, protects the interests and power of men. In looking at the quote here, sexual harassment is a form of bullying that men have tolerated because it serves to maintain the traditional pecking order, with men getting the high-paying and prestigious jobs and women getting the low-paying and low-prestigious jobs, which means that if we are allowing a culture which emphasizes and celebrates and brings up men. Don't be surprised when men have an interest to keep women down and not seek to raise up women in the organization. And unsurprisingly, with job gender context, it's been shown that a female underrepresentation in the workforce leads to higher rates of sexual harassment. Women in traditionally male dominant professions, unsurprisingly, experience higher rates of sexual harassment. It's been shown that women that are in careers in engineering and even in the military experience higher rates of sexual harassment. And how do we prevent this? Very simply, we need to emphasize gender equality in the workplace. And that can be through affirmative action, meaning that organizations actually take active steps to recruit and train women to be brought to executive positions. And successful organizations now understand that the workplace has evolved, where the actions in the 1960s TV show Mad Men are no longer accepted today. And unsurprisingly, organizations that tolerate sexual harassment and don't draw a red line will thus have higher rates of sexual harassment. And looking at coworkers, it's been shown that employees should be trained on how to support others who experience sexual harassment. If we want to decrease the occurrence of sexual harassment, we need to train our employees on how to support others to come forward. Lastly, opportunity is the degree to which sexual harassment is permitted or tolerated in an organization. Looking at immediate job context, if your practices in the job can either support or not support sexual harassment, meaning do you have windows in the offices so it is not a purely confidential workplace? Do you have men and women going on business trips together alone without accountability? And bad organizations will lack a clear sexual harassment policy. Or the policy focuses on remedy, meaning here's what we do when it happens, and it doesn't focus on prevention. And lastly, poor organizations will commit second assault, meaning that women are less likely to come forward because the attempt at justice or remedying the situation is as bad as the first. And what I mean by that is it's not uncommon for organizations to have the women who experience harassment come forward to a group of 5 men and explain what happened to her, which is a very shaming situation and is more likely to decrease the likelihood that women come forward. How do we prevent sexual harassment? Looking at opportunity, it's obviously having policies that prevent sexual harassment and have clear punishment and discipline procedures for those who commit it. As I stated, it's important that the policy both defines sexual harassment and states the procedure for what happens when sexual harassment is found. And that means that it is both on prevention, procedure, and remedy. Any such policy should have formal controls, process controls, and output controls. Looking at formal controls, they need to have procedures for hiring, training, and systems. There should be initial and repeated training, not just something that occurs at the outset of employment. And the organization should define the investigation process and remedy so women who do experience harassment know what to expect when they do come forward. And lastly, there should be multiple avenues for reporting. If the procedure is to go to HR when harassment occurs, what does the woman do when HR is the individual who committed the sexual harassment? Secondly, there should be process controls which establish management's commitment to the policy. As we've stated many times, it has to begin at the top. And it's the job of management to both motivate employees to act ethically and also enforce the sexual harassment policies. And lastly, it's important that organizations look at their actual behavior and measure against a standard. The easiest way to do this is to include sexual harassment assessment in the ethics audit. I want to thank everyone for listening today, and hopefully we've all learned things that we can take to our organization and work towards continuing to empower women in the workplace and to make safe work environments so that women can feel supported and can feel like they don't have to come to work every day in fear of being harassed. Thank you.